Shakespeare wrote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. And they have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." Welcome to the Timeless Homes podcast. This is a very first one, our inaugural one. I'm Clayton Vance, your host. And why did I start with Shakespeare? All the world's a stage. If you think about at the place where you live, the place where you shop, the place where you work, the place where you participate in this grand, crazy thing we call life, all of the architecture, the set pieces in which the civic life is laid out, in which we participate. And the architecture as the stage set used to actually be thought of many years ago very differently than the way we think of it today. And the most frequent request I get from people as an architect when talking about their dream house, their future home, whatever it is that we're going to design for them, the number one request I get is to make it timeless. And that is why we labeled this podcast series Timeless Homes, because we're going to explore the questions, the issues, the design principles, and how we can make a more timeless architecture. Because as you look around at what we build today, it's pretty rare that we actually get anything that in 100 years would still be worth keeping. And particularly the less money we have and the more average we are, the less we get to participate in really nice, attractive things, where back in the day that wasn't always the case. No matter what class you were a part of, because of the way they constructed and designed and did stuff, you still were surrounded by beautiful things. And now we're just surrounded by plastic and very temporary things. And what does that do to us emotionally? What does that do to us, psychologically, when everything we think of is so temporary? I remember, here's a little intro story. So my grandpa, I remember he lived on a hill on a mountainside, and it was snowing one time, and I was probably 18, 19 years old, and he asked me to go shovel the driveway. So I went down and got the snow shovel. It was metal, not plastic. It was metal with a wood handle, and it was broken. And I went in. I'm like, hey, this isn't going to work. Let's just go get a new one. And he's like, no, let's fix it. I'm like, are you kidding me? There's a broken, stupid snow shovel. Let's just go get a new snow shovel. And that was a very significant lesson to me that I didn't learn right then, but I did learn over time. And I remember that because it's had an impact on me, how we used to think of things. And the generation that we're all growing up in now, where everything is so temporary, so disposable. And we are now talking about sustainability, green architecture, all this other stuff. And I just have a hard time understanding or reconciling how we can have sustainable cities, sustainable architecture, and this green building initiative and whatever else everyone else is trying to press without bringing back that idea of how we think of stuff. Let's fix it. Let's not replace it. Let's fix it. And let's build with materials that can be fixed. Because it's kind of hard to fix plastic. You throw away plastic and you buy new plastic. But you can fix metal, you can fix wood, you can fix parts and pieces. And in a timeless architecture, think about like the old historic neighborhoods, wherever you live, wherever you come from, and think about, the details and how those buildings look. You can go to a neighborhood from the 1970s, 1950s. We can go to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and look at those neighborhoods, and they all look out of date, out of style within 10 years. Go to one from the 1920s and before, and for some reason, there's elements about that neighborhood, about that architecture, about those homes that seem to just get better with age. It might be dilapidated and it might be ugly, and the neighborhood might have gone into disrepair, but you can fix those up and, man, bring that all the back to its glory, back to its splendor. And those houses don't really need to be remodeled. You don't have to. You just paint them and fix them and paint them. But they don't have to be completely redone unless you have some functional needs that need to be redone. But the point is that architecture seems to get better with age, but we don't do that now. And we are going to explore on this journey in this podcast why. Because there's plenty of shows out there, plenty of info out there on how to do this, how to construct this, how to construct that. Plenty of stuff that's just straight up entertainment, that people just redesign things, and we're taught these cutesy little, put paint color here and just the trends. Really, the trends. That's what we're looking at is trends in design. But what I want to look at with you, and I want you to join me on this journey, is an inquiry into the real issues and have an honest discussion about what makes timeless architecture. It's weird. I ought to tell you a little bit about myself, but I was accepted to Cambridge to do a PhD to study the question of the long-term value of aesthetics in architecture, but I didn't have the money, so I never got to do it. And so this is just part of my, honestly, what I wanted to do back then, over a decade ago, that time just passes you by, and sometimes you don't get to experience those things. So we're going to be starting up, and feel free to donate too, because we need patrons, the Residential Design Institute, which will be both an educational and research institution to teach home design, and also try to get some empirical data on all of us and see what we actually really do think and what we believe in terms of architectural visual sustainability, if I can put it that way, for now. And then we're going to start calling it architectural beauty, but we first have to have a discussion about beauty before we can talk about whether or not we can even call it beautiful, right? So let's keep setting the stage. If all the world is a stage, and what sort of stage do we live in, and what sort of values are actually, and what's the narrative that we're trying to communicate? Because architecture communicates, our houses communicate, and whether or not we want it to or not, they communicate the values, the overall values. And right now, that overall value is, as far as I can tell, and please send comments and everything else if you think I'm totally wrong on this, but most of the time that value, and I think some of us are really starting to turn, is convenience and efficiency. And that was why we became enamored with technological advancements, and we had this thing called the car, the horseless carriage, and all of a sudden the carriage house, which was in the back where you put the animals, all of a sudden came to the front of the house out of convenience and efficiency, and to just look at how we thought of our technological advancements. Hey, show off. Hey, look, we have a 2-car garage. Holy cow. We have 2 cars to get around, and now we have 3 cars and 4 cars, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it has had a serious impact and effect on how we construct cities and how we design neighborhoods. It's had an effect on our zoning. And to do a traditional town these days in most of the U.S., you can't even do because of zoning rules, zoning laws in the engineering departments and municipalities. And we'll get into all of that. But right now, once again, let's just look at what this journey's fundamentally about. The question, what makes a timeless house? Another question, and I remember this came from my first year of architecture school at where I went to Notre Dame School of Architecture. It was a classical and traditional program, one of the only ones in the country, and it was very, very interesting because we explored ideas very differently than modernist schools. And I remember one of the questions that was asked right at the very beginning was it flipped the statement around. And I had personally never been asked this before, and it really did something to me, where I was just accepted the fact that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That particular statement, I just accepted that fact because that's what I was told, and that's what seemed to be reasonable. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, we all have our own subjective opinions on what we think is beautiful and not beautiful, and ugly and trendy and cool and nice and all those things. And so why wouldn't beauty be in the eye of the beholder? So this professor, he posed the question instead of the statement and said, is beauty in the eye of the beholder? And that opened up an entire new world to me of thought exploration in terms of how I perceived the cities I lived in, the architecture I walked through, and the houses that I experienced and now design. And we're going to explore that question, is beauty in the eye of the beholder? We're also going to look at cities. And because cities are necessarily composed of architecture, right, and houses. And so one of the things that we have to address is the architecture within the cities, but also how the street layout and the street grid and the street makeup and how that relates to architecture and how you create neighborhoods that are also timeless. Because when you live in a fast-growing area, particularly like in the southeast in the U.S. where there's a lot of growth, and in the Mountain West states where a lot of people are going to because they're realizing, honestly, the recreation is awesome and the weather and the seasons are pretty cool too. Those have been the fastest growing places in the U.S. as far as I can tell, and also down in Texas, southeast Texas and the Mountain West states, and some of the growth issues and how you as an individual can gain knowledge and understanding so you can help with your community leaders and visioning processes and that type of stuff. And then we'll get guests in here and everything. We'll talk about art, we'll talk about architecture, we'll talk about theory, we'll talk about philosophy, we'll talk about practical things, how to, why, but the most important things we're going to discuss is why. And because without understanding why, all this other stuff doesn't matter. Because it's just beauty in the eye of the beholder. And I began to explore the question as I was walking around neighborhoods, why does this feel good? It was weird. That question became very apparent when in my early 20s I was, interestingly, a flight attendant for American Airlines. You know, it's weird. Life is weird because you go through this journey. And sometimes you just wonder why life is taking you in certain directions and why on earth are you making some of the choices you make. And this was just a whim that I didn't have any direction. I'd wanted to be an artist, but realized that honestly wasn't for me. And had no idea what to do. And somehow I became a flight attendant for American Airlines in my early 20s. And I lived in Chicago. And I love Chicago. I lived in the Jefferson Park neighborhood, right off the Blue Line, and my eyes became opened as I went from city to city to city to city, night after night after night after night. I mean, just think about this. Think about this. If you have no vehicle and you are flying from city to city to city, night after night, and you have no way to get around, and you get dropped off at a hotel, and your experience with this city is what you can do on foot. What's your experience? And I'll tell you what, doing that and being able to compare and contrast, even though I was only doing it subconsciously because I was not consciously asking these questions yet. All I knew was I was going somewhere, and you'd walk out the hotel and you almost got run over. You're like, oh my gosh, this place sucks. Who wants to? McDonald's is across the street, the only place to eat. Oh, how delicious. And I can't get across the street because it's 6 lanes of traffic going both ways. And it's just absolutely normal. It's absolutely normal. And that is our normal. Really? That's our normal? Wow, what have we done to ourselves? And then I'd go to another city, lay over, walk out of the hotel, and there were all these shops, all these restaurants, all this awesome urban landscape that you could walk around and just really enjoy the city, engage with kind of the nightlife. And what's the difference? Why does one work and one not work? We'll get into that. A little bit more into why on earth would you even listen to this? I want to let you know I come from the Mountain West states. I've lived in virtually every state in the Mountain West. Lived in California also, and Oregon is where I went to high school, in Roseburg, which is a small town in southern Oregon with one high school and lots of timber. And so I'm used to, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up in standard suburban United States, split level houses from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And honestly, because you grow up with them, that's your whole experience with architecture. You really don't know any better at all. You have no idea, and you're still just infatuated with technology and new things. And I mean, still all these stinking phones and computers and gadgets and cars, and what's the next coolest thing that we really have a hard time in really engaging in great cities and great architecture. So it took me a while. It took me years and that experience as a flight attendant, to begin to understand what I actually really loved and how to ask the right questions. Because, one thing that I find really interesting is, I think one of the most important things you can learn in life is to learn how to ask the right questions. Because if you ask a question, particularly something that is not just straight science or mathematical, what's 2 + 2, it equals 4, and now we have all these crazy things that it might equal something else, or how you do this, and can't even wrap my head around that. But when you get into artsy questions and what makes great art and that type of stuff, since you can come up with an answer to virtually any question you're asking, if you ask the wrong question, you'll come up with an answer and feel smart, right? But if you ask the wrong question, then you're going to come up with the wrong answer, even though you come up with the right answer to the wrong question. And so, more importantly, I think the most important thing for all of us to figure out how to do is figure out how to ask the right questions. And to me, is beauty in the eye of the beholder? That's a question that I think can lead to some really enlightening things for all of us. The question of what makes something timeless, that's an interesting question that I think can lead somewhere. And making sure that we're not completely going down a rabbit hole or just trying to reinforce our own hypotheses. We need to be critical in terms of how we're exploring these ideas, but they need to be explored, because in all reality, I am sick and tired of just development garbage that's only designed to last 30 years, 40 years at most, and then we just tear it down and redo it again and tear it down and redo it again. And then we have these sustainable initiatives, these green initiatives, all this sustainable architecture and green architecture. It's just a bunch of garbage. Because unless something is visually sustainable in the long term, it's not truly sustainable. It's just not. And to try to persuade ourselves or convince ourselves otherwise, or making the ends something other than what the ends used to be when they would create cities, which was, and I don't even know how we begin to talk about these things, goodness, beauty, truth, that whole business, and trying to create the civic life and a beautiful city, which we have to address and have to talk about and have to come to some sort of common agreement in terms of what that looks like. Because in the end, architecture looks like something. And I struggled with that idea when I was in architecture school, because a few architects from times past wrote treatises. For those who don't know, treatises are just kind of a philosophical discourse of someone's ideas on a particular subject, and these architectural treatises they're really interesting to read, and we'll bring out some texts in some of them, but one of them was this idea of architectural perfection and beauty, and what that means. Is there perfect art? Is there perfect architecture? And can you actually achieve something that's so magically and perfectly proportioned and beautiful that it's the ultimate thing? How we talk about the Parthenon and its ideal proportions and that type of stuff. And I certainly buy some of that, and I don't buy other parts of it. But I struggled with the idea of perfection in art and architecture, because some of my classmates loved and believed that just straight up classical architecture was it. If you're looking at architecture stylistically, classical architecture is the good old Greco-Roman, columns and pediments and tablatures and that type of stuff. It's what you think of when you think of like the most of your state capitals. And I didn't buy it, because my tastes were so much. I just loved everything. I loved just great architecture, what I consider great architecture, which was also Romanesque and also Victorian and also any sort of Mediterranean style, the vernacular stuff, colonial stuff, just the whole gamut of traditional architecture I loved. And I began to ask the question, it's like, so why are these things inferior to this other architectural style? And I'm like, well, maybe they aren't. And then it just dawned on me one time. It's like, is there infinite variety within perfection? Is this idea of perfection, this idea of trying to achieve some magnificent thing, is it achievable, number one? And number two, if it is achievable, is it achievable in a way that it opens up an infinite variety of possibilities of creative exploration and design that are equally as perfect as the other thing? And the limitations of our language and ideas of what perfect is prevent us from truly exploring the creative possibilities that each of us have as individuals. Because if we look at ourselves as individuals, there are no two of us that are exactly alike. There are no two of us that we don't look the same. We don't act the same. We don't think the same, and you wouldn't expect that all of us should be the same. And it's weird because architectural architecture is a physical representation of those creative aims that each of us do as individuals, and the variety and richness of what we got at the turn of the 20th century is probably the greatest, just gamut of architectural exploration and probably the history of the world, and we'll go into that. But what I want to do is explore our individuality and individual tastes and help us all increase our aesthetic awareness of what makes timeless architecture. And so when we're driving down the road, we can actually explain why we like something or not like something, rather than just saying, I like that, but I don't know why. You'll be able to say, I like that, and here's why. Or I don't like that, and here's why. And where does modernism fit into all this in terms of an architectural style? We'll explore that too. And it does have its place. And and it can also be timeless in a way. And we'll explore that. But I think that probably sets the stage for our jumping off point and of this podcast series, Timeless Homes, and what we're about to accomplish. So just remember, all the world is a stage, and we are merely players.